on Facebook, so I hope everybody was behaving themselves the last couple seconds. So, but anyways, I'm Bill Phillips from the Prince George Daily News, and we're here with our regular weekly panel to discuss things that are going on in and around Prince George. We have as a guest today Josh Seymour, who is a councillor from Lheidli. And as in the past few weeks, we've been talking about racism and racist issues. And recently, just in the last week, what surfaced in this province was allegations that some medical staff in ER in hospitals around the province have been betting on blood alcohol content of people as they come into the ER, and most notably Indigenous people. And we'll go to Josh. What your comments are on this? You were saying before we went on air that you know, you've had some experience in this regard, not necessarily betting, but bad experiences in hospitals because you're an Indigenous person. If you could tell us about that and your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Well, what I always found weird is I remember the first time going to a hospital. I was about 13. I think I hurt my knee, and the nurse kept asking me how much have I had to drink, and I was like nothing. She goes, no, how much have you had to drink today? And I was like, oh, nothing. I'm 13. But it didn't register with her, and she kept asking like I was lying and I wasn't giving her the proper answer. But it was really bizarre because I was getting grilled about. Her asking me how much have you had to drink. I had to tell her about 4 or 5 times that, you know, I was 13. I've never drank in my life. I had nothing, but she didn't believe me. And I went in for my knee. It was dislocated. So.
Wow. So what are your you know, the allegations this week that you know, people are betting on it. You know, it hasn't been proven yet, and we've got Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond going to investigate it. And I think if there's anything there, she will be able to root it out. What are your thoughts on if that is actually true and if that's happening? People betting on blood alcohol content.
As much as I'd like to say it surprises me, it really doesn't. You know, I used to work in the frontline services, especially downtown, and a lot of the times when people would come to me with a pain or an issue, they never really want to go to the hospital, and they say honestly had to, just because of that barrier they face and that racist underlining of the questions. Whatever they answered, it was never the right answer, and they kept getting grilled like I did. And it's really bizarre that this is a system that nobody looks for racism in. They think racist would be, you know, outside with a poster saying, you know, this is how I feel, but it's not. It's what I like to call casual racism. It's built into a system that you don't see unless you're looking for it, and it's so ingrained within a specific culture that people don't realize it. They don't even realize that it is racist until somebody calls it out, but then they don't like being called out because they say that's how they've been their whole life. So this casual racism of like people who can casually take bets on what somebody's blood alcohol would be when they're trying to seek medical attention. I personally, I wouldn't go to a hospital if I found out that that's what they were doing in my case or any Indigenous person's case. I would actually avoid the medical system, and I think that's a big piece of why a lot of Indigenous people may have health issues is situations like this.
Mm-hmm. Tracy, what are your thoughts on this? You can just you can imagine that people would stay away from the health system, and just avoid going and getting care.
Well, absolutely. I mean, why would you go into a situation where you're already vulnerable because you're going in injured or sick and turning to people that are supposed to be there, bets on blood alcohol or grilling you over something that has nothing to do with the reason that you're there? It really blows my mind that people are being subjected to that. I mean, Josh says he's not shocked. I am shocked because I've never been subject to it. And the fact that there are people that are subject to it enough that something as heinous as that doesn't shock them, that's not the society I want my kids growing up in. I want that fixed, and I don't know how.
Todd, what are your thoughts? Can this be explained that it's just black humor in a stressful situation, or is there any rationale for this, or way to explain it away?
I don't personally think there's a way that you explain that away. I think what Josh's points really exposed is rooted systemic racism, and one of the largest conversations now is systemic racism, and he calls it casual racism. And it's almost so innate in your culture or ingrained in you that you don't really think about it, because oh, that's just how I was raised, or oh, that's what I've seen, or that's what I've heard. And that's really challenging. And Tracy makes a great point. Like it's challenging to hear that, because as a white male, I certainly haven't experienced racism directed at me in my lifetime. So I certainly can't. It would be hard for me to put myself in that position and really appreciate it. But that it's the precise example of systemic racism, where you say, boy, it's just so rooted that what do we do about this, and how do we change that? And it's troubling to think that that's going on, and you can't explain it away by saying, boy, that's a high stress environment. I think we all work in varying degrees of high stress environments, and we all have our ways of coping or dealing with that stress, and that racism or acts of racism should not be the way in which you cope with your own stressful situations.
Mackenzie?
Yeah, I think on the dark humor thing, I mean, I worked a lot of years ago in a funeral home, and we made a lot of pretty dark jokes while I was in that job, but they weren't dehumanizing like that. And that's where I think the issue comes in, and it ties into racism.
We're learning more about you, Tracy, that worked in a funeral home. You'll have to tell me about that sometime. I worked in a slaughterhouse, so there might be some comparisons there. Mackenzie, what are your thoughts? And I think we're kind of all aghast that that this is showing up in the healthcare system. Or you fear that this type of thing can show up in a lot of education system, probably in government and all that kind of stuff. How deep does all this go, I guess?
Well, I think it is there already. I mean, this movement is bringing it out, and we're starting to realize that it's deeply entrenched in our society, in every aspect of our society. So I think that we need to think about solutions moving forward, and starting with ourselves, because people are some are shocked that this is in our healthcare system, because how can nurses and doctors and people that are there to help us say things like this? Well, a lot of the time it's the covert racism, it's casual, it's something that we've learned, and that it's just been brushed under the table, and that we just awkwardly laugh around the table when someone we know makes a joke like that. So I think all of this is starting to bring to light how we need to step up and start saying things to those around us, because it's not going to change in our workplaces unless we start changing it at home first, and doing that internal work first, and thinking about, when have I done something like that, or when have I not called someone out because I didn't want to make it awkward, or when have I been uncomfortable? And as soon as we reflect on when we were uncomfortable and when we've personally done these things, as much as we want to deny that we haven't, we're very fragile when people bring these things up, the more we're just going to perpetuate it. So we have to really look at ourselves and say, okay, you know what, I have done some things that I'm not proud of, because I didn't mean to do it, but I know now because I'm looking back. And it's okay to say, I've changed, and I did something bad before, and I didn't mean to do it like that, and I'm going to acknowledge that wasn't okay. But a lot of people can't acknowledge it because they don't want to say that they were wrong and change, because their ego's too big, right? So we have to really be okay with admitting that most of us have probably done things like this. Covert racism and systemic, it's in all of our systems. So I think that we need to start at home with ourselves and then expand out from there. And that's the only way that we can, start changing this culturally, and then in our societies and in our workplaces.
Part of that too, I think, is being willing to accept someone's apology or someone's openness and willingness to come forward and say, I said this at X point in my life and I'm not proud of it now, or I posted this on social media, as opposed to vilifying and chastising people for what they may have thought at some point. I think we need to embrace the fact that they're coming forward and willing to change and willing to have a conversation, or willing to be a part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem. I don't want to stand up for anybody who's making those types of statements, but you know, this cancel culture doesn't allow for or it challenges the openness of the dialogue to move it forward. And I think that's got to stop, so that, to Mackenzie's point, we can have this discussion openly at the dinner table or out in public and move this forward.
Mm-hmm. I would just want to add one thing. I think it's very important that we do that and we accept people that have, you know, are changing and learning. But also if they're just doing it to be fake and hop on the bandwagon, right? Like if they're just posting about it because everyone else is doing it, we also need to be saying to them, like, you know, I see that you posted a black square, but you're, you know, the next day you're posting all lives matter. So, you know, or you're talking about it and I heard you saying those things, but you're posting a black square and I know that you're not genuine in your actions. And somehow we need to learn how to have those conversations with people, because they're very difficult to call someone out when they're being a fake activist, right? But it's optical allyship. It's when we want to look like an ally, so we put it out publicly, but we're not actually doing that internal changing, right? So I think that we need to be also keep our eyes open for those of us that actually want to have this conversation, for those people around us that are just doing it as optical allyship. So because that's not helping the movement at all, when people are just doing it to be fake, to hop on the bandwagon, and then the next day, you know, making jokes about blood alcohol levels. So
yeah, Josh, we've talked before about I think the understanding, or where we're moving now, is that a lot of people who sat silent, where a lot of these sort of, you know, covert racist or whatever things that are done, people have sat silent, but now the message is that, you know, you got to call this out. Everybody has to call it out in society. So how do and it's uncomfortable and it's not easy to do. So how can we call these things out in a progressive way without getting in a fight or something? You know, it's tough, right? It's really hard. Oh, you're on mute, Josh.
There we go. You see, and I always struggle with this as well. This kind of relates to the question I hear about reconciliation, because I'm always asked, well, how can people reconcile? How can people move forward in a good way? And it's gotten to a point where I've been asked a lot on how to do it, and it gets to a point where I have to tell them, I said, reconciliation, the onus is always on the Indigenous people. It's never they want me to tell them how to do it. When reconciliation is actually a partnership. It's a duality of how we work together and make this world a better place. But people always come to me and ask me, how do I do this? How do I do this? And I always thought, like, how would I call out racism? But I experienced it so much in one day that I would be calling out somebody every half an hour. Recently, actually, and it's weird because we're looking at systematic racism. People always want to look at the big corporations or the big businesses or the big facilities that are there to help people, but nobody ever looks at the small microaggressions that we face on a daily basis. I recently went grocery shopping and had the lady stop my till because there's mouthwash on there. She kind of was hesitant to sell it to me, which, I mean, I knew what was going on and I was so offended, but I didn't know how to call that out in a civil way, because you face that so much in a day that it gets to a point where you just shake your head because you just don't want to deal with it anymore. So calling out the racism, it would be tough, because it's all of our duties to call out whatever we see when it's wrong, and not just to call it out, but to offer solutions as well. I think if you want to be a true ally, you got to be able to find a way to work with people to make the world a better place, because it's a partnership. It's not just one person does this and one person does that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Josh, I think when you and I first met on the host society for the Canada Games was a prime example of you calling out racism in a effective way and then changing that organization. And I don't know if you'd be comfortable talking a little bit about that and how we met as the quote token long hairs on the host society.
Yeah, that was I made a joke. I said that when they do the photos, they're going to put me and Tracy in the front because we're the only minorities. And then they took a photo and they stuck us in the front. So it was really it was funny because you're able to predict that, and when it does happen, it just doesn't blow your mind anymore. But looking at how I've been able to call out racism, but not in an aggressive way. More of an open, like, how'd you not see this way, and try this instead. I've mastered the art of balancing the coming forward and being blunt, but also being kind to offer a solution. It's taken a long time because usually I come off as combative. So if somebody does something racist, you can't be like, hey, that's racist, and then they get all mad, and you hit this barrier where people don't want to be, when you call something out racist, they think you're calling them a racist, and when really you're like, no, that's just a racist action. I don't know how I would feel about calling somebody racist, because that kind of goes against what we're trying to do here in a partnership.
I think too, though, your style worked. I mean, the host society then moved on to have the Lheidli T'enneh as the first ever Indigenous host nation. So you were able to call it out, point it out, and then lead the way as we evolved as a host society and developed the games and showcased Prince George in a fabulous way. So I think your style works.
Yeah. Well, and it was it was really just asking for what I thought what we needed. Because I know there's a lot of, like, what I like to call lip service, or like, oh, hey, well, put up a flag, and I always do this because when we talk about reconciliation and people are like, well, we acknowledge your territory, I'll actually go into the crowd and I'll take somebody's purse, and I'm like, I'm gonna acknowledge this is your purse, right? She's like, yes. I'm like, well, it's mine now, but whenever somebody asks me whose purse this is, I'll say it's yours. And I said that's really what acknowledging is. It's understanding who it belongs to, but not really do anything about it. If you're not growing yourself to make the world a better place for everyone, you're not really growing. You're just staying in your own pot. So when we came to the Winter Games, I remember I had three things when I sat with the CEO. I said, I'd like to see our flag. I'd like to, play a bigger role rather than just the opening ceremonies and our language everywhere. And he says, okay. It just shocked me. So I was like, oh yeah, better be that way. And I walked away. And Lheidli T'enneh, actually, we had an old flag that we were going to redo, and that really put a lot of pressure on us to redo it. So the flag that you see today is the one from the Winter Games, and that's one that we created during the flag ceremony, which was the first time Lheidli T'enneh's flag actually flew in the city of Prince George, was during the Winter Games, alongside all of the provincial flags and territory flags and Canadian flag. And it was a big symbol because that's the first time we actually felt equal, that we were being represented on the same level as everybody else.
Not to mention the Lheidli kids singing "O Canada" at the opening ceremonies and what that's done for all of those kids and the generations to come.
And that was a big thing, was to have Lheidli T'enneh's language, not just lip service, but ingrained in the whole system itself. So within the welcomes, within the signage. And that actually was like the first games that were trilingual, so it was French, English, and Lheidli. And I think we set that precedent very high for the other games to follow, because when we went to Halifax, we watched the Mi'kmaq come in and do the opening, and then they performed, and then that was it. I wanted to see more of the culture of the territory we were on, but it just wasn't thought of then. And it just took somebody to say, well, why not? Why not these games? Why not, the ones at Prince George? Let's take this and let's set that bar high. And we jumped higher than the bar we set, which was perfect. But it also opened up that conversation between Lheidli T'enneh and the city, because there's a lot of history there that people do not understand, especially of Lheidli T'enneh and basically our home.
Todd, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's part of the games was probably a good example, but we need to, I guess the movement is to actually involve Indigenous communities more rather than simply, like you're saying, have them come out, wave the flag, sing the anthem, and then okay, go back in your corner somewhere. Is that, well, obviously, I guess that's a way we have to move past that to get actual involvement and an actual get Indigenous and people of color involved in a lot of these things and in meaningful ways rather than simply here's the come and do a song and stuff like that.
Yeah. First of all, the purse analogy, I'm going to steal that just so you know, because that's a brilliant, a very simplistic way of pointing out a very challenging issue, and I think it makes it very easy to kind of wrap your head around what that looks like. So I appreciate that. And you're talking to a guy whose background is communications and community consultation. And so when I was in Yellowknife for several years and got to be part of TRC discussions, that two-way communication is the only way forward. That was the only way that the note takers for TRC could understand some of the history that was going on. For myself, with CBC, we were broadcasting in 9 Indigenous languages, and getting to speak with our hosts about their experiences in residential schools and their families' histories and understanding what that looked like. It moves you from listening to having real empathy for a situation, but also understanding really intrinsically how bad that time and that situation was and what we need to do as a collective to move forward. And so I think about Josh's statement about being at a grocery store and the mouthwash being sort of this touchstone moment. As businesses, we have a responsibility to train our teams appropriately to understand that you can't lump everybody into one section, and we do need to have this as a community discussion to move anything forward. So, long answer to a short question. Yes, we absolutely need to do this in partnership. Yes, I think the Canada Games were an excellent starting point to that. I had no idea that was the first time the Lheidli flag flew in Prince George, so that's phenomenal and disappointing all in the same token. But it's set a precedent going forward, and that's what we need to continue to do, is continue setting a precedent.
Right on. Mackenzie, what are your thoughts on this? How can we get Indigenous communities more involved in at all levels, rather than just keeping pushing, and I guess that's probably what Josh has to do. But how can the other communities be involved in that and make sure that it happens?
Sure. I mean, obviously I'm not the expert on this topic either, but I'm glad Josh is here. But I do want to highlight something that Tracy was talking about, and you were talking about how you and Josh were like tokenized, right, and you were put in front for the picture. And I think all too often boards and businesses and the government says we need to bring them to the table. Well, that insinuates that we own the table. Like that's where we need to change it, right? We're not just allowing them to join us. They need to be a part of it equally, and not, it was great to hear about the flags. I actually didn't know that either, but Josh was saying, finally felt equal. And I think that's where we need to head to, and not just this, tokenism of, oh, that's, make sure that there's more Black, Indigenous, or people of color on our board. That's open up 2 more spots, to fill a quota so that we look good. Like we need to dig deeper. And I think that's what some businesses were doing a couple of years ago. Some governments were tokenizing their elected officials that were even women still, right? And Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And I think this has woken us up enough to show people, no, that's not enough. That is insinuating that we own the table, that when we're just inviting them to it, that's not a saying that we should use anymore, because that wasn't the right direction. And I think the more that we're open to admitting that that was incorrect, you know, because a lot of this is just a personal growth thing. We need to acknowledge and admit, okay, I meant to do that the correct way, but that wasn't the right way. So I'm going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to listen to the people telling me what the correct way to do it is, like Josh and other, Indigenous people in our community and Black companies and people on boards, and saying there's tons of resources out right now, especially right now. All of the resources are sold out everywhere, of books and podcasts and everything like that, teaching people the best way forward. So I think that we need to take in all of those resources. They're at our fingertips. I've talked about this before on this political panel, but I think that that's really, really important to highlight, that it's all right in our fingertips. The moment that you Google, how to be a good ally, or Rachel Cargill, or Layla Fassad, or any of these people doing this work, there's tons of people all across the world right now. So I think that's the direction that we need to move forward, is that internal. Oh, I hear a bit of a echo. But yeah, that's but that's the work that I think that we need to do to move forward, is listening first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, systemic racism is so insidious, and we talk about boards and hiring and that, it can come down to an employer who has two resumes that are equal, and he picks the white guy over an Indigenous person or Black or whatever, and it's like, how do you quantify that? Because that's an individual decision that's simply made, right? Any ideas on other than education, I guess, is the only way, Josh, to move forward from that?
Well, I think everybody needs to be open to change. You have to be willing to get uncomfortable, because the bubble that people are comfortable in is usually within that system that created the systematic racism in the first place. So I think in order to grow past that, we really evolve into a very uncomfortable zone, where we can actually speak about this in an open platform without being like attacked, and it's on all levels. And I think that's the one thing that we forget to look at, is the steps within racism itself. Because when people say racism, it's like a blanket statement, like I said before, but it's also there's steps, there's biases, there's prejudice, there's the systematic racism you may not see, and then it affects everybody. So if people are benefiting from it or not. So I think that in order for us to grow past this, we actually have to get uncomfortable and discuss this in an open area, because a lot of people don't even understand that there is a system there that may be racist. And actually to loop back to the Winter Games, the reason why Lheidli Tene was involved is because they wanted a support video for the bid, and then that was it. They didn't need anything else from us. And at that point, Chief Frederick said that we're not just going to be their tokens. So we actually went and crashed the mayor's office at the time. We actually did just walk in, and Chief Frederick said that we need a spot on the board if you want our bid video to go through. He goes, it's not okay that we can just come in and say we support it and that's it. We'll push to the side. And they said, sure, right? Who do you want to send? And I was standing beside him. He goes, Josh. And that's actually how it all began. But it was really having that relationship where we could do that without being stopped by security and without being hassled. So it's all about that. You need that relationship to feel genuine before you feel uncomfortable and grow. Tracy can tell you all about that, because our friendship has grown from where we can be just frank with each other. And I really appreciate that with Tracy, is that we can actually have those very open discussions without that judgment and the growth that comes from it, not only for her, but for myself as well. And it's helped me navigate through this system on how I can help basically expose racism, casual racism.
Actually, you led right into my question, because I was heading that way with Tracy too, because she's talked about that a couple times in the past, about some of the experience that you've had through the exploration place and with the Lheidli Tene, and how you've learned so much, and how that helps everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think that was the most distressing to me when the naming of Shasti as the school became such a mess in this community was that the exploration place, since before it was the exploration place, you have to go all the way back to 1992. We inducted all of the Lheidli elders as life members, and we created a permanent spot on our board for a Lheidli representative, which Josh has done a turn in, actually, with the goal of bringing those voices into a major educational facility that the entire community had easy access to. And we have done 3 major exhibits. We've helped with on-site and off-site exhibits. We have helped to form the Lheidli T'enneh's Elder Society, the Atsian Inc. Atsu. And yet still, when I watched what was going on, particularly in the comment feeds and letters to the editor, people haven't paid any attention. They don't know the history that created the relationship and the challenges that Josh is referring to between the Lheidli T'enneh and the city. And they've had the opportunity to learn these things. Josh and I have stood and taught teachers. We've been in classes. I've sent, I don't know how many of my staff to classes to teach these stories. And somehow or another, a vast chunk of our community managed to miss it all. And that's where I think Mackenzie's right. When she says this needs to be called out, when you hear it, you have to say, no, wait a minute, that's not actually what happened. And yes, in fact, the Indian agent burnt down the village houses to scare people into leaving. And those stories, if we don't understand our history, there's no way we can navigate our future. And I have learned more from talking to Josh and to elders and other members of the Lheidli T'enneh and the Sycus and the Notley and the Nakazli and the Mi'kmaq. They've taught me more about patience and learning and empathy and interconnectivity than I ever learned in any public school in my entire past. So I think people are missing not just the point, but a huge opportunity to learn and to grow. And, I'm a lot older than Josh, but I really feel like he and I have grown up together in a lot of ways since we met on that board all those years back.
Yeah. Todd, Tracy brought up the Kelly Road Shasti renaming, and that sort of pulled back another or shone a light on where a lot of the racism happens, and that's online and on a lot of people who you would normally think are nice people. You go and look at some of their comments on Facebook when all this is going on. It's like, holy man. So how can we deal with that, or how do we get around all that noise that happens on social media on this issue and a lot of others, other than just turning it off, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question. Growing up in an era where social media didn't exist, we called that telephone tough guys. That it's easy to sit on the other line when they can't reach you and
receiver down, right?
Yeah, exactly. Make an ignorant comment and walk away. That's kind of what the online community has become. You can do this under avatars and post hateful things. And in some aspects, I suspect these people truly believe those statements. And in some aspects, I suspect those people are trying to kick a hornet's nest and drum up controversy where controversy may not exist. But either way, it's not the right approach to it. How do you end it? I mean, I don't remember her name, and that's unfortunate, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But there was a young girl who was trolled online. They took pictures of her. She ended up committing suicide. They came out with online federal policies about how you deal with that. And the reality of it is, spreading hate like that online, it's equally as damaging and challenging. And I think we're seeing issues with people's mental health driving up like never before. And part of that is there's a willingness to have those discussions more openly now than there had been historically. But we're also inundated now with information from all sides. So you've got online news sources that are feeding this every day. You've got social media that's feeding this every day. There needs to be repercussions for people. You cannot sit idly behind being a keyboard warrior, posting hateful and inflammatory comments and just walking away from it with impunity. So it's incumbent that if there are, and I'm not 100% sure what the policy looks like at this point, if the policy doesn't extend to commentary, then they really need to examine that policy and say, listen, hate speech is hate speech is hate speech. It doesn't matter if it's on a Zoom meeting, face to face, or online.
Mackenzie, what are your thoughts on this, or touching on the school renaming, or just the social media morass that's out there?
Sure, yeah, I spend a lot of time on social media. So, and during the campaign, I had a really hard time not reading comments, because a lot of the time I was tagged in the comment. So it's not like I purposely would open it, it would pop up on my phone anyways, right? So it's very, very hard to get away from it. And I think that what Todd was saying, there needs to be repercussions from what you say online. And I know that it's not as easy as like, oh, that person's name, okay, that's called their employer, like I totally agree with that, but people use fake names. So it's not, it's very difficult sometimes to trace down who said it. In our case, in Prince George, not a lot of people use fake names, which is beneficial. So we can actually figure out who they are and keep that in the back of our minds for, in the future, especially if they're prominent people that are saying hateful things online, and, they're around a lot. We can keep that in mind. I do think that a good way forward is treating it as hate speech in person or online. And if you are caught saying something like this, if you are using your real name, then there needs to be repercussions in your life, whether that's your job or wherever if you're on a board or something like that. This needs to be brought to the attention, because it's not going to change their mind or do anything if you just comment back. You might have an army of people commenting back saying, oh my gosh, you're so wrong, how can you be saying these things? But nothing actually happens. They're probably not reading, they're just laughing about it anyways, right? So I think that we need to step up as a society, stand up to each comment that we see. It's emotionally draining to respond to every single comment that you see that is negative, though. So I completely, I don't respond to a lot of comments, because my entire day would just be like trying to fight trolls in the comment section. So if someone has already got there, I'll like their comment if they've stood up to this person, just to show that there's a lot of support on the other side. But as for, the emotional labor that goes into attacking these trolls, I think the best bet and, quickest way to take action is do a quick search of their profile and see if you can figure out where they're from, if you have the time and capability and resources and emotional, ability to work on that at this time. And I don't think that should be on the backs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Like, we need to be not just saying, oh, they're talking about, Black people, so it's Black people's problem to stand up for themselves. We need to also stand up for them as well, because that's what a society is about. So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, but that's one of the ways that's kind of the tactic I take.
Yeah, and we are coming to the end of our time here. So we just want to thank Josh for sitting in with us, and give you the last word, just a minute or two to say a few words.
Well, Tracy knows me best, and she knows you give me a minute, I'm going to take 12. So I'll try to make this as quick as possible. When we were talking about the park, the Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park, that was about 5 years ago. It was reclaimed. I always say reclaimed, because it was always Lheidli T'enneh, and then it was renamed Fort George Park, and then it's reclaimed as Lheidli T'enneh. And that's another thing, is that people always try to forget the history that is here. So they say, well, Prince George has been here for 100 years. Well, my people have been here for 9,000 years. So in order to say that we're erasing my 100-year history, you're eradicating my 9,000-year history. And that's only proof by lithical evidence. There's stories of us being here way before then. So when we're looking at how we can best support, I guess, Indigenous people in the areas to understand their history. We didn't just pop up when the forts and first people came here, because that's where history begins, is when when the voyeurs and colonizers came here to see, like, we didn't exist until we were seen by visitors. But we were here for thousands of years, and people forget that, and that's what aggravates me to a point, that when they can try to erase my entire existence for their memories rather than their history.
Super. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to our panel and Josh, and we'll see you guys again soon.